You woke up to the sounds of birds singing. You sit up and shiver as you leave the heavy warmth of your blankets. You breathe puffs around you like the white clouds in the sky. You do your morning chores with an extra warm jacket, feeding the animals and gathering water for morning wash. Winter's just around the corner, or perhaps it is already on your doorstep. The ground will get really hard and no longer provide edible plants, berries, and roots for your kitchen table. You chop up some firewood and kindling and set a toasty fire in the one-room cabin where your family no longer sleeps. Shuffling feet and busy hands fill the space as everyone works together to make breakfast and prepare for the morning chores. No one knows exactly when the first snowfall will arrive or how harsh the winter will be in this new land. So you must prepare for the worst. A grim determination sets about the crinkled eyes of Pa as he laces up his thick boots. There is no time to waste. What must be done? Before winter settled on the homestead, our family had a list of things to accomplish to ensure they were prepared for whatever the season threw at them. They not only needed some type of shelter for themselves, but also for the animals. They made sure they had a plan for whatever case their supply froze. Wells were dug deep into the ground, were usually below the frost line and safe from freezing. However, smaller creeks or ponds could freeze over completely. This meant that even those who had natural water source might have to dig a well to last them through the long winter months. Winter brought with them shorter days and longer nights. Pioneers needed to have plenty of candles or lamps so they could see in the late afternoon darkness, as they had no batteries or the flashlights that we have today. Perhaps one of the most important things to do, however, was to chop firewood. A typical family needed around 40 cords of wood in a year, and a lot of that was required for the long, cold winters when the fire never went out. Stand up and let's mark out how big that was. 4 feet high was about 2 normal steps. Take 2 steps. Okay. 8 feet wide was about 4 steps. Now imagine cutting enough wood to fill that space 40 times over. Ideally, wood needs to dry out before it's burned. In their first year, pioneer families did not have the luxury of waiting for their wood to season and had to use green wood.
What do you mean?
Which is wood that has not dried out. That's what green wood is. This wood is denser, heavier, and because it's wetter, it's harder to burn as well. Burning green wood can work if your fire's hot enough, but it causes a lot of smoke and less warmth. More sparks, which could be a fire hazard, and it's bad for your lungs. Fire was so important during the pioneer times that a family, if they left for any reason, they took their fire with them. Can you imagine? Usually a cast iron pot fires were carried along in the wagon to be kept alive and easily restarted when they arrived back home. If for some reason a home fire burnt out, someone rode over to the neighbor's house to borrow fire with no matches, and often green wet wood. Starting a fire was formidable. It was a formidable job and avoided at all costs. The task of chopping wood felt never ending. Once a stockpile was built up for the fast approaching winter, the family began preparing for the year after. The sooner wood was split and laid out, the drier it became, and the better it would burn. The first fireplaces, combined with damp wood, were usually not affected at heating the family home, but with dry wood and new designs to the fireplace that reflected. Once a stockpile was built up for the fast approaching winter season, the family began preparing for the year after. The sooner wood was split and laid out, the drier it became and the better it would burn. The first fireplaces, combined with damp wood, were usually not effective at heating the family home, but with dry wood and new designs to the fireplace that reflected the heat into the house, rather than just directing it out the chimney, warmer days were coming. Here's a little spotlight on the prairies. Stoves in the prairies were sometimes called hay burners because the pioneers had to burn whatever they could find. This often included animal dung. What's that? Poop. Hay, straw, grass, corn, and corn on the cobs, or corn cobs, and sometimes even grass. Cow pies, yes, it's exactly what you're thinking, cow poop, might even be hunted by taking the wagon and enlisting a family member or a friend to pile it high in the wagon. The prairie coal was then taken home and stacked in the straw shed to keep it dry. Eventually, the railroad would help alleviate some of this problem as wood and coal was transported to the prairies.
What about food? Having a fire for warmth and cooking was good, but you also had to have food to cook over it. Pioneer families likely packed extra dry goods such as flour, sugar, and whatever else they could before setting out west, with the intention of these goods lasting them through their first winter. However, they needed fat and protein as well. Wealthier families brought more animals, such as pigs and chickens, that they ate through the winter. However, many sold all they had, instead hunted, trapped, and fished. The process of preparing food involved the whole family and began as soon as possible. Since there were no freezers in the 1800s, meat was smoked or dried to make it last longer. Storing food was an important consideration for the livestock as well. Along the journey, animals foraged, but once winter hit, vegetation was scarce. This is one reason that pioneers chose their animals carefully. Oxen, for example, were not only strong, but also hardy. They could survive winter in the wild by digging in the snow for roots and shrubs. Pigs were another common animal brought along, as they could eat pretty much anything. As soon as they were able, families began chopping down bunches of grass and stored it in their temporary animal shelter or lean-to for winter feed. Like chopping firewood, they had to make sure they had enough to last. Whether for themselves or their animals, food was never far from a homesteader's mind as they sought to not only provide for today, but also for the many tomorrows. Do you remember the huge wagon trains that traveled together along the trails to their westward homes? Many of these families and groups settled close together. This meant that even though your neighbor may be hundreds of acres from your door, they were still near enough to help. There are many records of neighbors helping neighbors in the early years of setting up a new life. From stump digging parties to helping one another dig deep, lasting wells, homesteading was usually a community effort. It is easy to think of all pioneers as farmers, but that was not always the case. Many people migrated toward a new life with a variety of skills, experience, and backgrounds. While many farmed the land, there were other ways to provide for your family if you settled within a community. Doctors, for example, helped care for the sick or ailing and were usually paid for their work with food or livestock. In the early days, food and supplies were more valuable than money that couldn't be used, and trade was not only common, but essential.